Hello, my name is Mark Stacy. We're here today to interview Dr. Ira Shoulson for our MDS archives. Dr. Shoulson is an honorary member of the MDS Society, and it's our honor to hear him and his thoughts about movement disorders today. Ira, welcome.
My pleasure.
So we have a number of questions we're supposed to ask, but I think it's best to kind of start with what happened and why you decided to pursue neurology, and what do you think were the important steps along your pathway?
So my pathway, like many pathways, was circuitous, roundabout. When I went to college at the University of Pennsylvania, I had a lot of curiosity in many things, ranging from art history to research. And I developed an interest in research there. I worked with a Dr. Philip Teitelbaum, who was a physiological psychologist, described the physiology of the hypothalamus, what happens with stimulation or lesions in the lateral or medial hypothalamus. So I was one of the students there working in the laboratory. It was a nice environment, nice milieu, and I enjoyed research and that opportunity to do that. Fortunate enough, went to medical school at the University of Rochester, which really was a pivotal part of my career and also engaging my curiosity. One of the fortunate things that happened there is, as a medical student, I had an opportunity to be mentored by several people, which is, of course, the good thing that happens to many of us. One was George Engel, father of psychosomatic medicine. And that opportunity was once a week for 4 years, so 200 times. I and 5 other colleagues went around and interviewed patients live, and then we were critiqued by George Engel and our colleagues about that. So that experience of just the interview and the history really has stayed with me and been really very helpful over time. The other person was Bob Joyne, who was the head of neurology, the new head of neurology at the University of Rochester. It had been a division before that. He came from the University of Iowa, unfortunately just died recently, and had an incredible impact on me, especially his role modeling for being a nurturer, for sharing, for being so generative. And there were others over the years at the University of Rochester were very important, but that was key for me. I developed an interest in internal medicine and did a residency in internal medicine, and it was after that that I entered what we called the Berry Plan and went to the National Institutes of Health, where I had an opportunity to really get engaged in research. So I had no contact at all with neurology at the time, other than the role model and Bob Joyne.
I'd always heard, or not always heard, but I'd heard that the head of the NIH came to Rochester and you had a chance to meet him, and that had made an impression on you. Is that a part of a true story?
Well, I'm not sure about that, but what happened at the NIH when I got there is I worked, first of all, in the National Institute of Mental Health, so I was working in psychiatry. And in fact, what they called the lab chief at the time was Tom Chase, who was a neurologist, and he was really doing, at the time, he was doing clinical research in therapeutics like no one else was. And so he got promoted to a job as scientific director in the Neurological Institute. And I went in to congratulate him, and he said, "That's fine, this whole research ward of patients is now yours." And there were 30 patients, 20 with Parkinson's disease, 10 with Huntington's disease. I fortunately had enough clinical experience in internal medicine to take care of them, but the rest, in a way, was history. And I learned how to do research, and really did the first placebo-controlled trial at the time that we did. There was in 1973 to 75. And Tom he had, important responsibilities, but he still spent a lot of time with me, especially to teach me how to write and get the word out. So that was important. I didn't really train in neurology formally until 1975 through 77. I went back to Rochester and really had an opportunity to learn neurology. Of course, by that time I'd seen several hundred Parkinson patients and Huntington's patients. and also had a background in internal medicine. So it was a fun type of training. And I was chief resident in neurology and medicine over the course of a year. But the nicest thing, I think, looking back, the advantage that I had was that environment that was kind of enabling.
Right.
There was a mantra at Rochester, to each his farthest star, or her farthest star. And people like Bob Joint and afterwards Birch Griggs, made that happen. At 40 years of a enabling type of milieu of people say, anything that we could do for you. And these were top-notch people, so that was an important break that I took advantage of.
The culture of that really made a difference in terms of, I think, all of movement disorders with the start of the Parkinson Study Group. Can you tell us how that happened?
Yeah, no, that culture was important, and in fact, I think I sought out people who were I think if you had to characterize my career, I was kind of like a community organizer.
Yeah.
And I was happy to be able to have contact and interact with other community organizers, not the least of which was Stan Fahn. So I really looked to him because he really is one of the fathers of movement disorders. Right. And of course he, along with David Marsden, was the founder of the Movement Disorders Society. But we had a good sharing relationship. I learned much more from him than he from me, although he always says it, quite differently. But he was a wonderful teacher, and he was a good partner in terms of creating a community of researchers who would work together and share. But I think the one thing that I recognized too is people needed some return on the sharing, some return on that investment. So I was always keen in ensuring that there would be individual rewards for the collective engagement, and that still is important to me.
So as somebody who benefited from the Parkinson Study Group, in fact, in 1998, when I joined the Parkinson Study Group, I really felt like I had made it to an important step. Yeah. I think that's a testament to all the work that you and your organization had done. But if you could kind of go through talking about, maybe it isn't true, but the evolution of DataTop and how that became the Parkinson Study Group, I think that would be important for us to hear from you.
Yeah, I'd be pleased to. So this goes back to 1984 or 1985, I had completed a large controlled clinical trial in Huntington's disease, and it was called the Baclofen as Protective Therapy in Huntington's Disease Project. It was my first substantial NIH grant and support. And I learned from that, one is how to do a large clinical trial at a single site, but also recognize the importance of how does one generalize findings and how can one share in that. And around that time, working and talking with Stan Fahn and other people who were involved in that era, Tony Lang, Bill Langston, Jack Penny, Joe Jankovic, Peter LeWitt, and others, that we recognize the importance of trying to work together to do clinical research. I think I had a lot of organizational abilities, but it was really up to my colleagues to be able to work together at the time. So we developed the DataTop deprenyl and tocopherol antioxidative therapy of Parkinsonism clinical trial, and got funded the first go around with NIH, which is not the occasion these days anymore, and launched this clinical trial and spent an enormous amount of collective effort to do it. We had 35 sites in the US and Canada, and we knew that there was a real challenge here to make this happen. But we created, I think, not only a nice milieu, but a good group of friendship. Amongst the group, Carly Tanner came on board afterwards and added a lot to the group. So in 1986, 87, we launched the DataTop trial, which was, quite an experience just in terms of carrying it out. And David Marston was the head of our Data Safety Monitoring Board. I think we just called it Data Monitoring Committee at the time. And after working on this for about 2 years, he called me in one day and said, we think we're going to have to curtail this trial because there's something important going on. That isn't as important as the fact that we had to not just conclude the DataTop trial, but continue it, and went on for another 7 or 8 years in different forms. Once we had the infrastructure in place to do DataTop at the University of Rochester, we felt we should continue doing other studies instead of just disassembling it after a while. So we began doing trials with a variety of sponsors, including industry, and we think that, to me, that was also a great accomplishment because at the time, industry was not interested in working with academia on that. So by 1999 or so, we had under our belts not just the DataTop trial, but about 3 or 4 other trials, including those sponsored by industry. It was a wonderful experience. You don't know, because it goes so fast at the time, quite what's happening, but looking back. You mentioned that I was at the meeting of the Parkinson Study Group recently, where you come to a meeting like this at the Movement Disorder Society and you see all these posters up there from representing the Parkinson Study Group, a Parkinson Study Group study, and it gives me great pride. Also the Huntington Study Group, which founded in 1996, so that was a little bit later, around the identification of the gene for Huntington's disease. I'm still heading that up to this day.
So there's a recent movie called Moneyball that I saw on the plane coming through, and it talks about changing the paradigm of the way things are done in baseball. I really think you did that in at least clinical trial world. I'd like to hear what you think your major accomplishments are in your career from a scientific basis and from thinking about how you've changed thinking about Parkinson's disease.
Yeah, well, I think, it's hard to say in yourself what your major accomplishments are. I usually
This will be the hardest question I ask.
Well, you usually leave it to. Well, I know in 2008, when I was fortunate to be elected to the Institute of Medicine and then inducted in the Institute, they have, a 3-line thing about what your accomplishments are. So we should all be proud that they recognize that the formation of the Parkinson Study Group and the Huntington Study Group later represented an important accomplishment, to this prestigious organization. So I took a lot of pride in terms of that recognition, and to this day, it's very important. I've I think used that ability and gone on. I was one of the founders of the American Society of Experimental Neurotherapeutics, or ASCENT, and moved to Georgetown University last year and started a program in regulatory science. So I'm a starter. I'm an organizer. Moneyball, I'm not sure. Yeah.
So tell me, what does it take to do that? There's a difference between nurturing people and then trying to grab them together and put them on a train and point them one way. How do you think you did that?
I'm not sure, but I think a lot of it had to do with I was always mindful about return on this investment that people were making, but return to them. So there's a lot of younger people. I'd gone through this too, the whole issue, for example, of being advanced in academia. How many papers do you write yourself? You know, and it was really important to me from the first publication that we did that this was going to be the Parkinson Study Group DataTop investigators, or the Parkinson Study Group, whoever, and that we would list everybody in the acknowledgement. And it took a long time to get a lot of buy-in on that. But once we did, it was a great mechanism for people. People would always say, well, why don't you give me recognition? You take it. Yeah. Where it's right there for the taking, right. And the more you take, the better it is. So I think that's part of it, is to be able to give back in real time as we're going along. And also the fact that people would take over. I had a lot of, when I stepped down from the Parkinson Study Group in 2004 as leading that, it was also nice to see that there was a lot of traction, and that was moving along. So that was
it's a mark of a leader for an organization you create to continue after you're gone. I think that's another great testament to you. Your staff really is devoted to you, and how do you go about assembling a staff that can get behind what you're doing and move a whole thought process forward?
Right. Well, again, it's a hard question to know for sure how it is. It's a hard-working staff, so I mean, I try to work harder than the staff, and but I wanted them to work, almost just as hard, and some of them actually exceeded me. There's some examples of people like that, but that was important. I think also for the staff is to, this kind of the sharing and giving, as part of this whole project was very important. So I think to this day take, also a lot of pride. And the turnover in the staff has been really minimal over the years. There's people like Alice Rudolph, who was our first coordinator, who's still working in the Parkinson study group, Elise Kaysen, and the Huntington study group. So, that's wonderful. But people, I think, like, working in that environment. I think the last thing, too, is I learned this from Bob Joyne. He said, you can't always be right, but you can always be kind. And that was, a motto that we had.
Motto. Who else was important in your life and gave you some guidance about Parkinson's disease and further research in movement disorders?
Was people at the University of Rochester early on, from George Engel to Bob Joyne to Birch Griggs. I spent 40 years at the University of Rochester, so half of that was Bob Joyne, half of it was Birch Griggs, and they were very similar in terms of their nurturing and enabling capacities. Of course, Stan Fahn, when I moved into the movement disorder area, was a very important mentor, as was David Marsden. And you could see these were also different people who had great leadership capabilities, little different approaches, but wonderful people. So they turned out to be important for me. And of course, all the colleagues over the years, who I worked with. I mentioned a few, of course, Carl Kieberts and the whole group of fellows that came along in terms of our fellowship program that we still out there to these days. I run into them. It's a wonderful experience to do that. Nice ties.
The Clinical Therapeutics Fellowship, I think you started that. One of the things that I think has been really very positive out of that is you're mentoring them in a group to try to get their projects better defined, more clear, and to move them toward funding and implementation.
I think it's important to have a team and learn from them. One of the ways, first of all, I should just correct that it was actually Birch Griggs and I that developed that experimental therapeutics fellowship that still goes on to this day. I think it's in its 17th or 18th year of fellowship at the University of Rochester. The other thing that we set up was a co-mentoring milieu, whereby not only would somebody have a clinical investigator, but also a biostatistician or epidemiologist to work with. And we were fortunate there, the first one, Charlie Oderoff, David Oakes, Mike McDermott. You just can't do anything without learning that critical tool of experimental therapeutics. And although I've never been formally trained in statistics, mathematics, or biostatistics, it turns out to be a very key thing. And to this day, working in regulatory science, I appreciate that. So I think one is to not only learn the tools of clinical research, but learn the tools of biostatistics in this case is very, very helpful. The other advice is work outside your field. I mean, what we learned in neurological clinical research, we learned from the cardiologists, from the oncologists, from the infectious disease people, and we still learn and share. Maybe they're learning a little from us, but so I'd say the two things: work outside your field with people in statistics, mathematics, epidemiology, but also outside your field of neurology and movement disorder.
If you had to design a mentoring checklist, what do you think a junior person should look for in a mentor?
Well, I think, first of all, I think one needs to have several mentors if you're fortunate enough. There's not one person, so go around and try to find a few, because not one size fits all. Right. And I think that's important. But I'd look for people outside the field, people who are going to spend the time with you, as I said right from the first day, somebody who's going to sit down and correct that first manuscript and and be very critical but also constructive at the same time, to somebody who will also, at the other end of things, do introductions. So when you come to a meeting like this, part of your role is, here's my colleague Mark Stacy, here's somebody else. So I think that's a really vital part of it, is that connectivity, that I guess people call it networking.
Right. If you encounter a barrier or something in the past, how did you get around it, through it, over it? How did you go about solving that problem and moving something forward?
Well, oftentimes I didn't solve the problem and I failed. But, picking yourself up by the bootstraps and moving on is, I think, an important quality to have. Sometimes the fellows would come in chagrined that, their manuscript was turned down or their grant was turned down. I say, you just not even close to how many grants and manuscripts I've had turned down, over the while. So, failure is just an important part of success. It's actually a little bit true of clinical trials, just so you learn something. There's no such thing as really a failed clinical trial if you can learn something and move on. And the other thing is experimental therapeutics, unlike what people want to believe, is not a quantum leap type of process. It's very incremental. When you look at something like HIV therapy over the years, it wasn't done in a day. But you look back over a decade or two, my goodness, we almost have a cure for this.
If you could wind the clock back 20 years, what do you think we as a field should have done differently, and what would you have done differently?
Well, I don't have any regrets what I've done. I know that wasn't the question, but so I'm not particularly interested in doing that. But I think that one thing in the field of clinical trials that I've been involved in, I think the whole issue, and I feel guilty that a little bit we started this, the whole notion of neuroprotective therapy has kind of gone awry in the sense that, to me, the major difference between something that is so-called neuroprotective or disease-modifying versus symptomatic is how long or how sustained the benefit is. So, for example, if you had an experimental intervention that was shown to be beneficial not just for the 6 months or the 9 months, but for 6 years, and it had a sustained effect, it almost doesn't matter what the mechanism is. You have a sustained benefit. So I think, on the other hand, we are in need of things like biomarkers and the knowledge that comes from basic science. But I think we sometimes get too wound up in the mechanisms and target engagement, and not enough in terms of designing and conducting clinical trials that are relevant to patients and very informative, patient-centered types of outcomes.
Right. Yeah. Talk about how you have balanced your friendships, your family, and your work, and it's my sense that this is an important question because that is becoming increasingly emphasized in medical students and in residents, and we have to figure out how to better do that to keep driving our science forward. Yeah, no,
when you become a role model, it's for better or worse. Yeah. And people look at both parts too. Well, first of all, family plays a big role because it anchors you, and it's almost like a clinical trial in the sense because you encounter obstacles, disappointments, and failures that you need to overcome. But there's something refreshing about overcoming that. And seeing your kids grow up and the like, and we've talked about that before. It's not easy, but it's very satisfying. So certainly that's an important part of the balance. The only thing is that the family and the work gets often mixed together, and it has its advantages too. We traveled all over the world with our family, our kids, my wife, and still do, and that opportunity to see the world, meet people, engage widely is really valuable. Other than that, I spend a lot of time walking, reading, and writing, and I really enjoy that. Mostly beach walking, a lot of different reading. My wife's a big reader, so I get the hand-me-downs. And I like writing. I like doing little stuff on the side that's not even scientific writing, so that's kind of a new thing.
Well, I think you and I are both for brevity, and I've heard a lot of things that I knew about you, but some things that I have learned about you. I appreciate the time. I'll point out that You did get a call from your son just before this started, and I think that's an important part of work-life balance, and I'm glad to hear things are going well.
Well, thanks, Mark. It's my pleasure.
Good.